In the dim twilight of the Appalachian wilderness, where ancient pines clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers, the year 1887 hung heavy with unspoken dread. Whispers slithered through the underbrush, carried on winds that seemed to moan with the weight of forgotten sins. Far from the clamor of burgeoning cities, in a hollow shrouded by mist and myth, there dwelled a man of unnatural stature, 7 feet and 3 inches of raw, unyielding might, his frame a grotesque monument to isolation's cruel forge. They called him the mountain giant, though few dared utter the name aloud, for fear it might summon his shadow from the crags. The air in those woods was thick, oppressive, as if the trees themselves conspired to guard secrets buried deep in the earth. Nights brought not silence, but a chorus of faint, anguished voices, pleas that twisted into the rustle of leaves, cries that mimicked the howl of distant wolves. Villagers in the valley below spoke in hushed tones of lights flickering unnaturally high in the peaks, of figures glimpsed in the fog that defied the scale of mortal men. But none ventured close, for the giant's domain was a realm unto itself, where the boundaries of family and abomination blurred into something profane. It began, as such horrors often do, with a solitary traveler, a seeker of truths long entombed. Drawn by tales spun in dimly lit taverns, where old men nursed their ails and eyed strangers with suspicion, he ascended the treacherous paths. The ground grew uneven, roots snaking like veins across the soil, and the canopy above closed in, blotting out the stars. Each step echoed with a sense of encroachment, as if the forest itself pulsed with awareness, watching, waiting. The traveler's lantern cast wavering pools of light, illuminating gnarled trunks etched with crude markings, symbols that hinted at rituals older than the settlements below. Deeper into the gloom, the voices grew clearer, no longer mere illusions of the wind. They were feminine, fragile, laced with despair that clawed at the soul. "Father, no more," one seemed to murmur, dissolving into the night. The traveler paused, heart pounding in rhythm with the unseen dread, unaware that he teetered on the precipice of a revelation that would unearth the giant's most heinous legacy, a lineage forged not in love, but in the chains of his own blood, daughters bound to a cycle of terror in the heart of the mountains. The mystery hidden in the woods beckoned, promising answers that might shatter the fragile veil between sanity and the abyss. In the autumn of 1887, the first whispers began to drift down from the high ridges of the Smoky Mountains like smoke from a fire nobody could see. At first the people of Tuckasegee Hollow thought it was only the wind threading through the laurel slicks, the usual mournful music of the highlands, but night after night the sound returned, thin, high voices riding the cold air, sometimes a single wail, sometimes 2 or 3 braided together in a harmony that raised the hair on every neck that heard it. They were women's voices, or girls, fragile and pleading, yet carrying for miles over the dark valleys as though the mountains themselves had learned to speak in sorrow. By the middle of October the whispers had shape enough that men could almost make out words, "Help us, his coming, don't let him," before the wind tore them apart again. Dogs refused to leave their porches after sunset. Children woke screaming with no memory of their dreams. The preacher at the little clapboard church declared it the devil mocking the righteous, but even he locked his doors before full dark and kept a loaded rifle across his knees. Down in the settlements the stories grew. Travelers passing through spoke of seeing a lantern moving far above the tree line where no trail existed, a single yellow eye bobbing at a height that belonged to no ordinary man. Hunters who had ranged those slopes all their lives suddenly found excuses to stay low. One old trapper swore he had glimpsed a figure crossing a ridge at twilight, a silhouette so tall it blotted out entire stands of spruce as it passed, shoulders broader than an ox yoke, head level with limbs that should have been 30 feet off the ground. He came back down the mountain shaking, beard white with frost, and never set another line above the 4,000-foot mark again. Word spread beyond the hollow. A newspaperman from Asheville rode in on a lathered horse, notebook in hand, hungry for sensation. He found the villagers tight-lipped by day, but in the tavern after midnight, with whiskey loosening tongues, the tales poured out. The giant who had lived up there since before the war, a man or something wearing the shape of one, 7 feet and 3 inches of bone and gristle, face lost in a thicket of black beard, eyes the pale grey of river stones. They said he had come down only twice in 20 years, once to trade pelts for salt and ammunition, moving through the streets like a pine tree walking, scattering mules and children. Both times women had crossed themselves and pulled their daughters inside. Yet no one had ever seen him with family, no wife, no kin. The cabin, if that's what it was, sat miles beyond where any sane person built, past landslides and bare wallows and cliffs that dropped straight into mist. Smoke rose from its chimney only when the coldest nights, thin and blue and quick to vanish. And still the voices came, night after night, clearer with every frost, until the entire valley seemed to throb with them, a chorus of trapped souls calling from somewhere inside the dark green fastness. That was when Elias Crow arrived. He was not a lawman nor a preacher nor a reporter chasing copy. He was something quieter, a listener of stories most folks wanted buried. He carried a battered journal, a Colt Navy with the grips worn smooth, and a reputation for walking into places others fled. When he heard the voices for himself, standing on the porch of the empty boarding house while the wind brought those fragile pleas curling around his boots, something inside him settled with cold certainty. Whatever waited up there in the high hollows had gone on long enough. The mountains were hiding more than shadows, and the whispers were not wind at all. They were invitations, or warnings, or both. Elias tightened his pack, checked the loads in his revolver, and started up the forgotten trace that no local would follow even for $100 in gold. Behind him the valley held its breath, and above him the night voices rose again, nearer now, threading through the black trunks like stitches pulling a wound closed. The trail Elias followed had not known a human foot in years. Rhododendron closed overhead like a tunnel, and every few yards the path pinched to nothing, forcing him to turn sideways, pack and all, the wet leaves slapping his face with the smell of rotten iron. By late afternoon of the second day the wind died entirely and the forest went muffled, as if the world had been stuffed with cotton. That was when he smelled the smoke, thin, acrid, carrying the bite of green hemlock. He crested a knife-edge ridge and saw it, a single curl of grey rising from a notch between two bald peaks, the kind of place maps left blank. The cabin crouched in a hollow no wider than a churchyard, built so close under an overhang of granite that the roof was half cave. Logs the size of ship masts formed the walls, bark still clinging in great plates, silvered by weather. The door stood twice the height of a normal man and twice as wide, bound with iron straps gone orange with rust. No window glass, only narrow slits that stared down the slope like empty eye sockets. A stone chimney leaned away from the cliff as though trying to escape. Everything about the place felt wrong, too large, too old, built for something that had never been wholly human. Elias approached at dusk with his revolver drawn. The door hung open a handspan. Inside, the air was warmer than outside, thick with a sour animal reek that coated the tongue. His lantern threw a weak circle across a dirt floor packed hard as pavement. A fireplace big enough to roast an elk gaped black and cold. Iron hooks the length of scythe blades hung from the beams. On a table fashioned from a single slab of walnut lay the journals, dozens of them, bound in rawhide gone stiff as armor. They were stacked like bricks, edges warped from damp, covers branded with the same crude symbol he had seen carved into trees on the climb, a circle split by a jagged vertical line. He opened the topmost book with the barrel of his Colt. The pages were thick handmade paper, ink faded to brown, handwriting angular and huge, each letter half an inch tall, as if written by a man whose hands could not manage delicacy. The first entry was dated March 12, 1869. She screamed until her throat bled, but the mountain took the sound and gave nothing back. The child is strong. 7 pounds at birth and already the bones feel wrong. Elias's stomach turned. He flipped further. The entries grew shorter, colder, ritualistic. 1871, second girl. Eyes the color of creek ice. She will do. 1874, the boys did not take. Buried them under the laurel where the ground stays soft. 1880, third daughter quickened again. The line must stay pure. The mountain demands it. Names were never used, only the vessel, the brood, the sire. Sketches filled the margins, crude anatomical drawings of infants with elongated limbs, measurements scrawled beside them, femur 11 inches at 3 months, skull circumference impossible. One page showed a family tree that was no tree at all, just a single thick trunk branching into itself over and over, the same 2 names repeating until the ink smeared. Between the journals lay locks of hair tied with sinew, pale blonde going darker with each generation, and small bones polished bright, finger joints mostly, arranged in neat rows like a child's collection of pretty stones. A larger book at the bottom was locked with a hasp of forged iron. The key hung on a rawhide around a deer antler above the hearth, out of reach for any normal man. Elias stood on the table to get it. When the lock snapped open, the smell that rolled out was sweet and sickening, like spoiled milk and blood. Inside were photographs, tintypes warped by damp, showing a towering figure in a long duster, face lost in beard and shadow, one massive hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a girl no older than 14, belly swollen under a shapeless dress. Behind them, two smaller girls stared at the camera with eyes too wide, too old. The lantern flame guttered, though there was no draft. Somewhere deeper in the cabin, wood creaked under a weight that made the whole structure sigh. Elias closed the book slowly, the hair on his arms rising as the realization settled cold and heavy in his gut. The giant was not dead, not gone. He had simply stepped out, and the journals had been left like bait, or like a warning, pages still open to the newest entry, dated only 3 nights past, the ink barely dry. The stranger climbs. He smells of gun oil and city lies. Soon the mountain will teach him what purity costs. Night fell hard, the way it does above 4,000 feet. One moment bruised twilight, the next a blackness so complete the lantern felt like a child's toy. Elias had barely stepped out of the oversized doorway when the first sob reached him, close, human, broken. He swung the light and saw her pressed against the far wall of the lean-to shed, a girl no more than 17, barefoot in a ragged linen shift, arms wrapped around her swollen belly as though holding it together by will alone. Her hair, pale as corn silk, hung in damp tangles to her waist. Her eyes caught the lantern and threw it back, huge and colorless, reflecting the flame like an animal's. She flinched when he moved, shrinking into the corner where the log walls met stone, but she did not run. There was nowhere to run. The shed was a cage with one wall missing, built for storing cordwood, now storing her. A chain of forged iron, each link as thick as a man's thumb, ran from a ring bolt in the floor to an iron cuff around her left ankle. The skin beneath it was raw, blackened in places, wet with fresh blood where she had worried it open again. Elias lowered the revolver but kept it in his hand. "I ain't him," he said softly. "I ain't here to hurt you." The girl's lips trembled. When she spoke, her voice was barely a thread, cracked from screaming or silence, he could not tell which. "He knows you're here. He smells you on the wind," said a man with death on his belt would come sniffing. She laughed once, a sound like glass dragged over stone. "Said when you came he'd let me watch him split you down the middle." He knelt, keeping the lantern high so she could see his face. Up close she looked even younger, cheekbones sharp with hunger, collarbones standing out like wings under the thin cloth. Her belly, though, was monstrously round. She could not have been more than weeks from term. "How many of you are there?" he asked. Her gaze slid away. "Were 4. 2 little ones didn't breathe right. He planted them under the laurel like seed corn." She touched her stomach with fingers that shook. "This one kicks hard. He says it's another girl. Says the mountain likes girls." Elias felt the cold seep deeper than the night air. "Your sisters. One's gone to bone. The other," she lifted her chin toward the black wall of trees behind the cabin. "He took her walking 2 nights back. She was crying for mercy. I ain't heard her since." Tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks, but her voice stayed flat, as if sorrow had been used up long ago. "He calls us his wives. Says the Lord turned his face when the war took everything else, so he made his own covenant. Says our blood's the only clean thing left in these mountains." She shifted, and the chain rattled. A dark stain spread beneath her on the packed earth. She had been squatting in her own filth for days. Elias saw the bruises then, thumbprints the size of silver dollars on her thighs, on her throat, on the soft inner skin of her arms where something huge had pinned her down. "He comes when the moon's gone," she whispered the girl. "Stands over me till I feel small as a mouse. Says I'm the vessel now. Says when this one's born he'll start again, keep the line strong. Says giants used to rule these hills before men with axes came, and his the last, and we're how the world gets put back right." Her eyes found his again, and for the first time something fierce flickered inside the emptiness. "You kill him," she said, not a plea, a command. "You kill him slow, or he'll climb inside your dreams and make you beg to join us." She pressed both hands to her belly as the child inside gave a sudden, violent lurch, the fabric of her shift jumping. In the lantern light her smile was terrible. It knows its daddy's near. Dawn came thin and sour, the color of old pewter, sliding down the granite face behind the cabin like water finding every crack. Elias had not slept. He had sat with his back to the oversized door, revolver across his knees, listening to the girl's chain clink whenever she shifted in her shed and to the forest breathing around them, slow, patient, waiting. When the light was finally strong enough to see by, he began to search in earnest. He started with the laurel thicket she had spoken of. It grew in a hollow 50 yards below the cabin, a tangle so dense the sun never touched the ground. The soil there was black and rich, turned over in too many places. He did not have to dig far. 6 inches down his boot heel struck something soft that gave with a wet pop. He knelt and brushed leaf mold away and found a tiny ribcage no longer than his hand, still laced with scraps of rotten flannel. Nearby lay a skull the size of a crabapple, sutures not yet fused. He counted 5 such patches before the smell drove him back, 5 small graves in a perfect half-circle, each marked by a fist-sized stone painted with the same split-circle brand burned into the journals. Higher up the slope he found older leavings, a woman's button boot, heel snapped off, half buried under moss, a rusted corset stay, a child's iron rattle filled with mouse bones. Every artifact carried the same oversized proportions, as though the mountain had been feeding on a race apart. Behind the cabin, wedged between the cabin's rear wall and the cliff, stood a cairn of flat stones taller than Elias himself. When he pried the top layers away, he uncovered a hollow space lined with oilskin. Inside were bundles wrapped in yellowed newspaper dated 1859 to 1865, Confederate scrip, a daguerreotype of a young couple, the man already towering, the woman tiny beside him, eyes downcast, and a leather pouch heavy with gold eagles, enough to buy half of Tuckasegee Hollow twice over. At the bottom lay a folded fragment of parchment, edges charred, ink spider-thin but still legible. It was a land grant signed by the governor of Tennessee in 1798, awarding 2,000 acres and all that lies beneath to one Obadiah Crow for services rendered against the Cherokee. Beneath the official seal someone, Obadiah himself, perhaps, had added in the same jagged hand from the journals, "The old ones walked here before the red man. Their blood remembers. We keep it warm." Elias was still crouched over the parchment when the wind shifted and brought him the copper smell of fresh blood. He followed it to a lightning-blasted chestnut at the edge of the clearing. Someone had carved the trunk a dozen times with an axe too heavy for any normal man. The cuts were shoulder-high on Elias and went bone-deep into the heartwood. Sap still oozed pink. Nailed to the scarred bark with iron spikes longer than railroad ties were strips of skin, human skin, peeled in perfect rectangles and left to cure like hides. On each strip the same symbol had been carved while the flesh was still living, the circle split by the vertical line, edges curled and black with old agony. He was prying one of the strips free when he heard the girl scream, not the thin wail of the night voices, but a full-throated, animal, cut off as suddenly as it began. He ran back to the shed to find the chain lying empty on the ground, the cuff sprung open like a broken jaw. Only a single drop of blood remained, bright and new, already drawing flies. In its center lay a lock of pale hair tied with a blue ribbon he had not seen before. From somewhere high above, deeper in the folds of the mountain than any man ought to climb, came an answer, a low, rolling laugh that shook loose stones from the cliffs and sent them clattering down like bones in a sack. The laugh rolled down the ridge again, closer now, a sound too big for any human chest, wet and hungry, the way a bear might laugh if it had learned cruelty from men. Elias stood in the ruined clearing with the sprung cuff still warm in his hand and felt the mountain tilt under his boots, as though the granite itself had decided to shrug him off. He did not run. Running would only tell the thing how far its voice carried. Instead he walked back to the cabin, slow, deliberate, the way a man measuring the length of his own grave. Inside, the journals had been disturbed. Every volume lay open, pages fluttering though there was no wind. Someone, something, had dipped a finger in fresh blood and drawn a single thick line down the center of each exposed page, splitting the cramped handwriting the way lightning splits an oak. On the table waited one new entry, scrawled so hard the quill had torn through the paper in places. She fought tonight. The child is early. The mountain is thirsty. Bring me the stranger's heart and I will let the girl live long enough to name her daughter. Elias stared at the words until they crawled. Then he noticed the footprints, bare, longer than his forearm, pressed deep into the packed dirt floor, leading from the hearth straight through the back wall. The logs there had been torn outward like wet paper, splinters the size of fence rails hanging inward. A ragged hole gaped into blackness that smelled of wet stone and birth blood. He followed because there was nothing else left to do. The tunnel slanted down at first, then leveled, the ceiling rising until his lantern could no longer find it. The walls were carved smooth, grooves running in spirals that hurt to look at directly. Water dripped somewhere, slow as a pulse. After 100 yards the passage opened into a cavern the size of a cathedral, its floor littered with bones arranged in careful spirals: infant bones, child bones, women's bones, all polished white and stacked like cordwood. In the center rose a slab of granite worn hollow by centuries of bodies, its surface black and shining with new blood. The girl lay atop it, legs spread, shift rucked to her breasts, belly deflated and ruined. Her eyes were open, fixed on the darkness above. She was still breathing, shallow, frantic, but her lips moved without sound. K. Kneeling between her thighs was the giant. He was naked, skin the color of river clay stretched over bone that had never known restraint. 7 feet 3 inches standing, but crouched he still loomed, shoulders brushing stalactites, beard matted with old gore falling to his waist like a curtain. In one hand he cradled a newborn no bigger than a skinned rabbit, slick and blue, umbilical cord still attached. With the other he held a stone knife the length of a scythe. The child's mouth opened in a silent cry, the giant's pale eyes lifted and found Elias across the chamber. "Too late for this one," he rumbled, voice rolling like boulders down a chute. "But the vessel is strong. She'll quicken again by spring." He raised the knife. The girl's back arched, a final, soundless plea. Elias brought up the colt and thumbed the hammer. The cavern swallowed the click, gave nothing back. The giant smiled, teeth too many, too long. "Shoot," he said. "Bullets only wake what's sleeping under the stone." Behind him, deeper in the dark, something vast shifted with a sound like roots tearing free of bedrock. The lantern flame bowed toward it, stretched thin, and the shadows began to crawl forward on their own, reaching for the light with fingers made of every voice Elias had heard on the wind since Tuckasegee Hollow. The girl's lips shaped one last word he could finally read. "Run!" The colt roared 6 times in the cavern's throat, each flash a brief white sunrise that froze the giant mid-motion, knife raised, newborn dangling like a baited hook. The echoes slammed back and forth until the chamber sounded like a battlefield. When the smoke cleared, the giant had not fallen, he had only taken 1 step closer, the bullets buried somewhere in the wall of meat and gristle that was his chest, black holes already knitting shut with threads of something darker than blood. He looked almost curious, head cocked, listening to the mountain drink the lead. Elias did not reload. He let the empty revolver drop and drew the Bowie knife he had carried since Shiloh, 12 inches of pitted steel that had opened more men than he cared to remember. The giant watched the motion and laughed again, softer this time, intimate, the sound of a father amused by a child's play. The girl on the slab gave a sudden convulsive shudder. Her belly, flat and torn now, rippled as though something inside still fought to be born. A thin wail rose, not from her throat but from the stone itself, echoing up through cracks too narrow for light. The newborn in the giant's fist answered with its own mewling cry, and the 2 voices braided together, climbing higher, until every bone in the cavern began to hum. That was when Elias understood the voices in the dark had never been the daughters alone. They were every child that had failed to breathe, every daughter bled dry on that altar, every scrap of life the mountain had taken and refused to release. They lived in the stone now, hungry, waiting for the next heartbeat to steal. The giant took another step. The newborn's cord stretched, still tethered to the girl, pulling her ruined body an inch across the slab. Blood pattered like warm rain. Elias moved first. He went low and fast, knife reversed, driving upward under the giant's ribs where no normal man would have space between bone. The blade sank to the hilt in meat that felt like wet hickory. The giant exhaled a furnace blast of rot and wrapped one hand around Elias's entire torso, fingers meeting in the middle of his back, lifting him until his boots kicked empty air. The pressure was instant and absolute, ribs creaked like green timber. Yet the giant hesitated. Something in Elias's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or the simple absence of begging, made him pause. In that pause Elias twisted the knife, soaring sideways, felt it scrape something that pulsed like a second heart. The giant's grip loosened a fraction. Elias dropped, rolled, came up with the fallen lantern. He smashed it against the altar. Kerosene splashed across the girl, across the newborn, across the giant's legs. Flame whooshed up blue and greedy, eating the oilskin air. The giant roared, more surprise than pain, and beat at the fire crawling up his beard. The cavern answered. Stones split with gunshot cracks. Dust sifted from above like grey snow. The bone spirals collapsed inward, clattering, forming new patterns that hurt to follow. From every fissure the voices poured out now, no longer whispers but a storm of women and infants shrieking in a language older than Cherokee or English. The flames turned green, then white, climbing the giant's body faster than flesh should burn. He staggered backward, newborn still clutched to his chest, and the altar cracked down the middle beneath the girl's weight. Through the fissure rose a thicker darkness, something wet and eyeless that wrapped around the giant's ankles and began to pull. He looked at Elias one last time, no longer laughing, and spoke a single word that was not a word at all but the sound of roots splitting rock. Then the mountain took him. The girl slid from the broken slab into the fire and was gone. The newborn's cry cut off mid-note. The flames folded in on themselves and died, leaving only the smell of scorched hair and wet stone. When the dust settled, Elias stood alone in the dark, knife melted to a nub, clothes smoking, listening to the sudden, terrible silence of a debt finally paid in full. Elias crawled out of the fissure on hands and knees, lungs full of smoke and something older than smoke, something that tasted of iron and lullabies sung backward. The tunnel had collapsed behind him in a roar that felt like the mountain exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. Dawn was bleeding across the eastern ridges, thin red light that made the spruce look dipped in fresh slaughter. The cabin was gone. Not burned, not fallen, gone, as though the cliff had simply closed its mouth and swallowed the logs whole. Only a raw scar of earth remained, steaming faintly, strewn with splinters no longer than kindling. The shed, the journals, the oversized door, the iron chain all erased. Even the laurel thicket had folded in on itself, leaving a sinkhole ringed with uprooted trees that pointed inward like teeth. He found the girl's body, or what the fire and the mountain had left of it, half a mile down the slope, tangled in a stand of dog hobble. She lay on her side, knees drawn up the way a child sleeps, face turned toward the rising sun she would never see again. The newborn was curled against her breast, smaller now, almost peaceful, the cord withered to a dry black string. Both were cold, skin already taking on the grey sheen of high-altitude stone. Elias closed their eyes with fingers that would not stop shaking and covered them with his coat, though he knew the bears would have it by nightfall. He sat there until the sun cleared the ridge and the frost began to burn off the grass. Only then did he notice the quiet. No wind, no birds, no insects, nothing. The mountains had gone mute, as if every living thing within 10 miles had either fled or been struck deaf. Even his own heartbeat sounded muffled, like it belonged to someone else. When he finally stood, the valley below looked unchanged, the same quilt of autumn color, the same curl of smoke from Tuckasegee chimneys, the same narrow road winding south toward civilization. Yet everything felt thinner, as though the world had been scraped down to its last layer and whatever lay underneath was now watching through the scratches. He started down. Halfway to the tree line he found the revolver lying in the middle of the trail, cylinder open, 6 spent casings still warm though hours had passed. Beside it lay a single page torn from one of the journals, edges scorched but the writing intact. The ink was fresh, the letters huge and deliberate. The line lives in the stranger now. Carry it far. Let it forget. He stared at the words until they stopped making sense, then folded the page and put it in his pocket next to the lock of pale hair he had taken from the shed floor. When he tried to pick up the Colt his hand passed through it as though the metal dissolved into grey ash that blew away on a wind he could not feel. By the time he reached the valley the silence had followed him. Dogs did not bark. Children did not laugh. The preacher stood in the churchyard staring up at the peaks with eyes too wide, mouth working soundlessly. No one asked where he had been. They only stepped aside when he passed, crossing themselves or touching iron, as though he carried a plague they could smell but not name. Elias kept walking, south and west, following roads that grew wider and louder with every mile. Behind him the Smokies slowly shrank to blue rumors on the horizon, yet the quiet traveled in his chest like a second heart. Some nights, in boarding houses or beside campfires, he would wake with a woman's voice, sometimes young, sometimes ancient, whispering against the inside of his skull, "Father, no more." He never answered. He only saddled his horse before dawn and rode on, carrying the mountain's last seed deeper into a world that still believed its monsters were only stories.